There is a war happening right now that most people in Canada and the United States think they understand. They have seen the headlines, they watched the clips, they know the names: Iran, Kuwait, US bases, missiles, drones, ceasefire. They think they have the shape of the story. They do not. Because the strikes on Kuwait are not primarily a story about Iran's anger. They are not even primarily a story about military power. They are a story about choke points, about who controls the narrow passages through which the entire global economy breathes. And right now, in June of 2026, that story is sitting directly on top of the economic life of every Canadian watching their gas bill, their grocery bill, and their mortgage rate move in ways that feel disconnected from a conflict happening 10,000 kilometers away. On the surface, this looks like another exchange of fire in a Middle Eastern conflict. But underneath it is a story about whether the rules of global energy trade, rules that have held since the 1970s, are about to be permanently rewritten. And the person deciding whether to rewrite them is not sitting in Washington. They are sitting in Tehran. You are about to understand this story in a way that most people covering it do not. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and turn on notifications, because this story is not sitting still. As of this week, a tentative ceasefire deal has collapsed. Iran has threatened to fully close the Strait of Hormuz again, and oil markets moved 7% in a single day on that news alone. What happens in the next 72 hours will matter. You will want to have been here from the beginning. Here is what mainstream media covered. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iranian military targets. The strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Iran responded almost immediately, launching what it called Operation True Promise 4, a wave of ballistic missiles and drones targeting American military bases across 7 countries in the region: Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. In Kuwait specifically, the coverage focused on the explosions, footage of smoke rising over the Ali al-Salem airbase, reports of injuries, the Kuwaiti government issuing statements defending its sovereignty, the US military describing the strikes as unacceptable, Iran claiming it was only targeting the infrastructure being used to attack them. Most coverage stopped there. The follow-up stories focused on casualty counts and diplomatic statements. A few outlets noted that Iran had closed the Strait of Hormuz. Most treated that as a footnote, a dramatic detail in a larger story about missile exchanges. But here is what most coverage missed entirely. Kuwait was not a random target. The specific bases Iran struck, the specific timing, and the specific infrastructure it chose to damage were part of a calculated logic that took months to design. And understanding that logic is the only way to understand what is actually happening right now and what comes next. Let me place the key figure in this story correctly, because this is not primarily a story about Donald Trump, and it is not primarily a story about any single Iranian commander. The central figure here is a decision-making architecture. It is the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and specifically its aerospace division, which designed and executed these strikes. These are not impulsive actors. The IRGC has spent decades building what military analysts call an anti-access area denial strategy. The technical name is A2/AD. The plain language version is this: Iran cannot defeat the United States in a conventional military engagement. They know this. They have always known this. So for 40 years, they have been building a different kind of military. One designed not to win battles, but to make battles so expensive and so painful that the other side eventually decides the cost is not worth it. The strikes on Kuwait are a direct expression of that doctrine. The IRGC Aerospace Division that planned and executed Operation True Promise 4 was not trying to destroy the US military. They were trying to demonstrate something specific: that every base in every country hosting American forces is reachable, that the cost of using those bases is not zero, that the countries hosting those bases, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, need to calculate whether the relationship with Washington is worth what Iran can do to their airports, their ports, and their oil infrastructure. This was not anger, this was communication. And understanding the difference changes everything about how you read what happened next. To understand why Iran chose this moment and this method, you have to go back further than February 28th. The Strait of Hormuz is a body of water approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, 33 kilometers. A body of water so narrow that you can see across it on a clear day. And through that narrow gap passes approximately 20% of the world's crude oil, every single day, about 21 million barrels. Iran sits on the northern shore of that strait. Oman sits on the southern shore. For decades, the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, existed primarily to guarantee freedom of navigation through that strait. The implicit message was always, you cannot close it, because we are here and we will reopen it. What the 2026 war revealed is that this guarantee was more fragile than almost anyone outside classified intelligence circles understood. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz on March 4, 2026, warning all foreign vessels away under threat of direct attack, the U.S. Navy did not immediately reopen it. Because the Navy's assets in the region were suddenly under sustained attack from the same A2/AD doctrine that had been building for 40 years. The Fifth Fleet base in Bahrain was under persistent fire. CENTCOM moved personnel. Air defense systems were being tested and in some cases overwhelmed. The International Energy Agency called what followed the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That sentence deserves a pause. Not the largest since 1973, not the largest since the Gulf War, the largest in the history of the global oil market. And here is the open loop I want you to hold. If Iran can close the Strait of Hormuz even for weeks, not permanently, just episodically, what does that do to every calculation every government in the world makes about energy security? Because the answer to that question is driving every negotiation happening right now, and we will come back to it. Now let me show you what Iran was actually doing while the world watched the smoke over Kuwait. The strikes on Kuwait were loud, they were visible, they produced footage, they produced diplomatic protests. Kuwait's foreign ministry issued statements. Saudi Arabia expressed solidarity. Every anchor on every network had something to say about sovereignty and international law. That was the visible layer. The invisible layer was the strait. While governments and media focused on the missile exchanges, on the spectacle of bases being struck and drones being shot down, Iran was doing something far more consequential and far more quiet. It was using the chaos of the strikes to establish a new baseline, a new normal. The message was not just, we can hit your bases. The message was, we can decide what moves through the most important waterway on Earth. Contrast that with the American approach. President Trump, on March 6th, declared that the only acceptable outcome was Iran's unconditional surrender. On March 9th, he said the war was essentially over. On March 15th, he set a deadline. Then he set another deadline. Then another. By the time the ceasefire was arranged by Pakistan on April 8th, the United States had burned through enormous diplomatic credibility, and Iran had established, in practice, something it had been trying to establish rhetorically for decades. The U.S. could threaten, Iran could endure. That contrast between the loud strategy and the quiet one is the heart of this story. Here is the second open loop. If Iran's real goal was not to win a military exchange, but to change the world's perception of whether the strait can ever truly be guaranteed, has it already won that argument? Even if every missile is eventually answered, every base eventually repaired, every negotiation eventually concluded, does the memory of those weeks in March 2026 permanently alter how shipping companies, insurance markets, and national governments calculate risk in the Persian Gulf? I do not know. But that question is driving billions of dollars of decisions right now. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are where the story stops being abstract. Brent crude oil, the international benchmark, was trading at approximately $75 per barrel before the war began. Within days of the strait closing, it surged past $120. $120 per barrel. That is a 60% increase in the price of the commodity that powers virtually every aspect of the modern economy in a matter of weeks. In Canada, gasoline prices rose approximately 30% between late February and early May of 2026, according to data from global petrol prices. Diesel, the fuel that moves freight, fills farm equipment, and powers logistics, rose by more than 30% as well. Now here's what that 30% means. Oil and gas represent roughly 7% of Canada's GDP. The conventional wisdom said Canada would benefit from high oil prices. Producers in Alberta would profit. The oil patch would boom. And that is partially true. But the Globe and Mail's economic analysts noted what the optimists missed. The gains in the energy sector, which is a relatively small slice of the economy, are more than offset by the inflationary effects running through the rest of the economy. Food costs are up because fertilizer moves through the strait. Freight costs are up because diesel is more expensive. Manufacturing inputs are up. The gains in Calgary do not cancel the losses in Mississauga. The U.S. military, meanwhile, burned through stockpiles that will take years and billions of dollars to replace. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated that over 7 weeks of conflict, the U.S. used at least 45% of its stockpile of precision-guided missiles, half of its THAAD interceptors, nearly half of its Patriot air defense interceptors. These are not weapons you can order from a warehouse and receive in 90 days. 5 numbers: 60% oil price surge, 30% Canadian gas price increase, 45% of U.S. precision missile stockpile consumed, 20% of global oil supply disrupted, and a ceasefire that, as of this week, is producing new oil price swings of 7% in a single day. The numbers are not footnotes to this story, the numbers are the story. Let me bring this out of the boardrooms and the briefing rooms, because at some point every geopolitical confrontation of this scale stops being about governments and starts being about people. In Windsor, Ontario, auto workers who depend on supply chains that run through global shipping networks are watching input costs rise. The factories they work in depend on components that move by sea. When shipping costs spike, and they have, those costs eventually reach the assembly line floor. In Saskatchewan, grain farmers are getting hit from 2 directions simultaneously. The diesel they need to run their equipment has become more expensive, and the fertilizer they depend on, a significant portion of which moves through the Strait of Hormuz in the form of ammonia and urea, has become harder to source and more expensive when you find it. Joseph Glauber of the International Food Policy Research Institute has noted that up to 30% of global fertilizer exports pass through the strait. That number lands differently when you are a prairie farmer looking at your input costs for the planting season. In Alberta, the calculus is genuinely complicated. The energy sector is benefiting. Producers who locked in forward contracts at the right moment are doing extraordinarily well. But the inflationary pressure running through the rest of the provincial economy is real, and the political conversation about who benefits and who pays is only beginning. And here is where I close the first open loop from earlier in this video. Remember the question: what does it do to every government's calculation about energy security if Iran can close the strait episodically rather than permanently? The answer, at the ground level in Canada in 2026, is this. It means that energy prices are no longer determined primarily by supply and demand dynamics in North American markets. They are now partially determined by decisions made in a negotiating room in Oman, and by whether a ceasefire that has already cracked multiple times holds for another 60 days. That is a permanently changed risk environment, not just for energy companies, for families. Here is where the story goes from here. I am not telling you which of these scenarios will happen. I am showing you what the structural incentives make most likely. Scenario 1, the managed settlement. Iran and the United States signed the Memorandum of Understanding that U.S. officials said was nearly agreed this week. A 60-day extension of the ceasefire goes into effect. The strait reopens to full commercial traffic. Nuclear negotiations begin. Oil prices fall back toward $80 to $90 per barrel as the supply shock eases. The war becomes a terrible and expensive episode that both sides eventually frame as a draw. Markets stabilize. Canadian energy prices ease. The world exhales. In this scenario, the damage, military, economic, diplomatic, is enormous but bounded. Scenario 2. The slow fracture. The ceasefire holds on paper but continues to crack in practice. U.S. forces conduct what CENTCOM called self-defense strikes near the strait. Iran responds by pausing negotiations and threatening to fully close the waterway again, which is exactly what happened this week. The strait operates at reduced capacity, not because it is formally closed, but because shipping companies, insurers, and cargo operators are pricing in the risk of moving through it. Oil prices do not spike back to 120, but they do not fall to 70 either. They settle somewhere painful and persistent, around $95 to $100 per barrel. Inflation stays elevated. The Bank of Canada's rate decisions become harder. The war never ends cleanly. It just fades into an unresolved confrontation that reshapes global energy markets for years. Scenario 3, the full break. The MOU falls apart. Trump's additional demands on the Strait, on Iran's nuclear stockpile, and on frozen assets, which Tehran has explicitly rejected, proved to be non-negotiable from the Iranian side. Iran follows through on its threat to fully block the Strait. The U.S. military, which has burned through a substantial portion of its precision munitions, faces a genuine decision about whether to resume large-scale combat operations. The global oil supply disruption becomes acute again. Brent crude moves back above $110. Central banks face the nightmare combination of slowing growth and rising inflation that economists call stagflation. Canadian households are hit by the full force of both an energy shock and an interest rate environment that cannot ease fast enough to cushion it. I am not telling you scenario 3 is coming. I am telling you that as of June 2nd, 2026, the structural incentives for it are more present than most mainstream coverage is acknowledging. Here are the questions nobody can answer yet. And these are real questions, not setups, not rhetoric, not teasers for the next video. These are genuinely unresolved. 1. Iran's chief negotiator said this week that there is a price for every choice, and that price must be paid. That is not diplomatic language. That is a signal. The question is, what specific concession is Tehran actually requiring before it will allow the Strait to reopen fully and permanently? Not the public demand, the actual one. Because the gap between what Iran says publicly and what it will accept privately is where this negotiation either succeeds or collapses. 2. The American Enterprise Institute estimated that Iran struck more than 100 targets across 11 bases in 7 countries, and that the damage to U.S. equipment and infrastructure was far more extensive than the Pentagon publicly acknowledged, with repair costs likely reaching into the billions. If that assessment is accurate, what does it mean for the United States' actual capacity to resume and sustain large-scale combat operations in the Gulf if the ceasefire fails? That question has enormous implications for every scenario I just described. 3. Kuwait's foreign ministry said Iran's missile strikes were a direct threat to Kuwaiti sovereignty. Saudi Arabia echoed that framing. But behind the public statements, the Gulf states, who depend on the Strait for their own oil exports, are making private calculations about whether their long-term security is better served by alignment with Washington or by some form of accommodation with Tehran. That calculation has never been more live, and nobody outside those palaces knows which direction it is moving. I do not know the answers. Nobody does yet. Remember where this story started. An Iranian drone on February 28, 2026, struck a U.S. military base in Kuwait, Camp Buring, while simultaneously an Iranian F-5 fighter jet penetrated the base's multi-layered air defense system and conducted a successful bombing run. The first successful hostile aircraft strike on a U.S. base in decades. Most coverage called it an escalation, a provocation, a test. By the time a ceasefire was arranged in April, that single day had produced a 7-week conflict, the largest oil supply disruption in global history, a ceasefire that keeps fracturing, and a negotiation that as of this week is still not closed. Because Iran stopped exchanging messages with American intermediaries in response to ongoing violations and threatened to fully block the Strait again. The drone did not just hit a base, it hit the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz is permanently guaranteed. And that assumption, once you realize it was an assumption and not a fact, changes everything you thought you knew about energy security, about the cost of conflict, and about why the decisions being made in a negotiating room in Oman right now land in every household in Canada paying more for gas, more for groceries, and more for almost everything that has to move to reach them. That is what a choke point looks like when it stops being hypothetical. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because this story is not over. It is not close to over. Iran walked away from negotiations this week. The MOU is unsigned. The Strait is being contested again as of this recording. The next move could come tomorrow. It could come tonight. The scenarios I described are not abstract. They are live. And when the next development breaks, and it will break fast, you will want to have been here from the beginning.